Hey everyone, welcome to the Current Case Podcast. We're a group of four friends discussing the latest current events as they apply to our everyday lives. From foreign policy to local events, we cover it all as best we can in a manner not restrained by the bias of the big media corporations. We may not always agree with each other on certain topics, but that is what makes it all the more interesting. Being able to sit down and have a civil conversation on even the most controversial topics is a necessity for a better society.
Good evening, everybody. Today is February 1st, 2023, so we're just going to jump right into it today. This past weekend was the Cincinnati Bengals AFC Championship game. Of course, all of us are from Ohio. I'm not particularly a Bengals fan myself, but I was watching it, came in when Matthew was watching it towards the second half of the game, and what we saw, we were pretty outraged by the end of it. Cameron, were you watching it? You were shaking your head.
No, I heard about it. That was so bogus. They do this every time the Bengals are like, when it becomes apparent the Bengals might actually win, like just look at the Super Bowl last year. It was like they were letting them play all game, and then suddenly in the last quarter when it's apparent the Bengals might actually win this thing, then suddenly they got to call them on everything. It's pathetic.
Yeah, that Bengals game, Super Bowl game was, as you said, that was pretty ridiculous. Calling everything towards the end, calling nothing at the beginning of the game, and then this game, just tons of missed calls. Lots of players, lots of people in general on Twitter were just calling out the refs majorly. This isn't the first time. Of course, the NFL's been in hot water for its officiating. Honestly, I feel like the NFL is one of the worst leagues, professional leagues, in terms of officiating. Only the NBA is probably worse than them, but what they were doing here, of course, I was with Matthew at the time watching it when they had that third down chance at Kansas City. It was like 3rd and 9 twice.
Oh, but the fans were loud and couldn't hear the whistle. So they get like 4 new attempts to do it.
Right. It's like, this is a professional sports league. How do you fuck up that bad? It doesn't make any sense at all.
I think part of the problem is really that, in my opinion, I think the NFL is kind of soft-rigged. I know that sounds like an outlandish claim, but hear me out. The WWE is hard-rigged. That's not what I'm saying here. WWE, there's a set winner every time, and that's how it goes. That's not the case with the NFL, but I do think that the officiators will look at how senior officiators make calls, and they'll try to imitate those and favor certain teams, be it consciously or subconsciously, so that they can, stick around for a while, get promotions, and ultimately so the NFL can make more money. Nobody wants to watch a boring championship game between two teams nobody cares about. So obviously the officiators are going to try and set it up so that we have an exciting matchup. And I think that's a big problem with this whole thing.
I completely agree with you, Cam. I remember a couple of years ago was the LA Rams game against the Saints. That was back in 2018. And then in the NFC Championship, there was that missed pass interference call at the very end when that Rams player completely took out one of the Saints receivers. And that should have been a flag. Everybody saw it. The refs just held on to their whistles completely. They effectively put the game in favor of the Rams, because if they had called that, they would have effectively ended the game, and the Saints would have gone to the Super Bowl. But the Rams had just recently moved to LA at the time. Their market ship in LA was pretty low, so as you said, I think there's definitely a lot of soft rigging in the NFL where the refs wanted, or the league wanted, the Rams to go to the Super Bowl just to get that LA market boost. And I think sports betting as well, because it just very, very recently became legal in Ohio, past January 1st, so about a month ago now.
And did you see the head coach who was officiating that game? Apparently his son had placed a pretty large wager.
A head ref.
Yeah. And of course he's denying it, saying he had no knowledge previous to the end of the game. However, regardless of whether or not he knew, I don't think anyone involved in the NFL should be allowed to bet on games. Sounds a lot like insider trading.
It really does, and that's what I'm concerned about going forward with sports betting becoming more widespread, how it's going to affect the outcome of the game. I think it's definitely making the soft rigging a lot more plausible. I feel like there's plenty of proof now just the way games are officiated. This many horrible penalties, and not just this game, but throughout the past seasons. It's this can't be a coincidence. It can't be just the refs are incompetent. These are supposed to be professional refs.
Yeah, well, you also look at how the commentators talk about it, they, God forbid, they praise the Bengals for anything, but when Bills or some other team are doing great, it's oh yeah, they're really good this season. They're doing great. And it's the hell, man.
I know, Tony Romo especially. He's getting lots of flack. I mean, they've just been hopping on their favorite quarterback like Mahomes or Josh Allen on the Bills and just constantly riding them and giving no credit to the other team. You know, the NFL definitely wanted that AFC neutral site with the Bills and Chiefs, and you could tell like Tony Romo and the commentators are disappointed when the Bills didn't do anything in that game. So, and I think like the Bengals made themselves kind of a villain because they were calling out the NFL for that dumb coin toss idea and then selling tickets before the actual game.
Yeah. Well, also, why did they have to play at a neutral stadium if they had that matchup? But the matchup that actually happened, they can just play at one team's home field. Why is that okay? Doesn't make any sense.
It didn't make sense to me either. Like the whole thing. I mean, I know like the DeMar Hamlin situation was very unique. It hadn't really happened before, or something that I had to deal with a long time. But still, I think things could have been handled a lot better post that incident than they were by the league. So I think the league deserves lots of flack for...
This is why I stopped watching football, because all this stuff became so apparent. It just pissed me off, and I stopped watching it. And I came back, Jared, oh, you need to watch football. So I did, and then this is what we get out of it. All right, no more football.
Yeah, it's disappointing. Like, I'm not saying the game was completely rigged in favor of the Chiefs. I mean, the Bengals could have done things that would have won them the game. They could have performed a lot better, but the refs definitely called in favor of the Chiefs.
I think it was just that one last interception in the fourth quarter that the Bengals threw. If that wasn't intercepted, I don't care how many flags you throw, they probably could have squeaked away with it.
Yeah, probably.
But the problem is that's how the Bengals have been winning all season. It's just getting by because of terrible calls.
Yeah.
At least the past 3 games from what I've seen.
Right. So, I mean, like I said, teams could still help themselves winning along the way. I've never seen a game where the refs just completely screw over a team. And, I mean, rare instances, but teams still
I think we just saw it, Jared. I think that was
all I'm saying is I think the Bengals still had chances to win even despite the refs, but they just didn't execute.
Like, I saw on Twitter, even the Steelers fans who despise the Bengals were calling out the NFL. Being like, we hate this team, but we hate what's going on with the calling even more.
I mean, yeah, which I agree. It was outrageous. And that punt return, that essentially ended the game. There was a big block in the back and holding as well that the refs just did not call against the Chiefs. I know that another thing people are pointing out was that roughing the pass, or the late hit out of bounds on Mahomes, which I think that one was a legit penalty. I mean, he was definitely out from what I see.
He was just moving. I don't think it was intentional.
That one was more like a bang-bang, but that one, you could say that could be called, but the missed block in the back, that was definitely outrageous by the refs for missing that. And, I mean, that one essentially ended the game because that set them up for the field goal.
You know, I just think it's pathetic. I think football sucks.
Damn. You're not American?
Well, certainly the way the NFL has been handling this sort of thing really does suck. That I think we can all agree on.
Shame I'm so hopelessly attached to a team. Otherwise, I'd be like, oh, fuck this, I'm out of here. So, and other league news is that Tom Brady announced today he's finally retiring, maybe for real this time, because last year he announced he's retiring and didn't actually retire. So, is he gone for good this time?
I don't care.
You don't care about Tom Brady?
Not particularly.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really keep up with football, but I think this is probably the right move. I mean, he's been playing for so long that all he can really do at this point is, like, hurt his legacy by continually playing. And if he, like, screws up or anything, makes just terrible plays and starts playing worse because he's getting older. I mean, I don't know that has happened. I don't think it has, but, you know, it has the potential to happen. And there's really no point tarnishing his own legacy like that. And it's kind of a weird situation, right, where he's been playing for so long that there are people that, like, looked up to him wanting to play professional football, and now they're, like, playing with him. You know, it's kind of strange. I think he's been in the game too long.
Right. I mean... Last year, there was that whole drama. I mean, he went through a divorce this past season. So whether or not that was in terms of football, but I think it's time for him. I know he's a big perfectionist. I mean, he has really nothing left to prove. Won 7 Super Bowls, 6 with the same team, 1 with another team in Florida. So it's like, nothing left to prove. You get that money and have a good career. Goodbye. I never want to see you again. You have ruined my football dreams. All right, anybody else have something to add?
I think football sucks.
Shit. Damn commie over here. Speaking of commies, let's shift over to some geopolitics. So,
yeah, what are those Russian bastards up to?
So Russia has been violating the START nuclear arms control treaty by not allowing our own investigators to go over there and actually, inspect their nuclear arms. So the treaty was re-signed again in 2011 and extended back in 2021 for 5 more years till 2026. But now, this was yesterday, the Russians also said that they might not even renew the deal when it ends in 2026, and they are blocking our own team from going over there and, of course, inspecting the nuclear arms. And this was a deal that was created right around the peak of the Cold War, right after the peak of the Cold War, to help ease relations with the Soviet Union, or not ease relations, but ease tensions with the Soviet Union, and of course incorporate better cooperation between the two. So by them doing this, you can argue that tensions with Russia, or relations with Russia, are just at an all-time low. I think as close as it was during the peak of the Cold War.
So you're telling me, they're not big chilling over there? This isn't a sign of peace?
Since when have the Russians ever been chill?
I don't know. Putin seems pretty cool.
Yeah, before the worms ate his brain and he started invading Ukraine.
Yeah, something like that.
The worms ate that. That's very true. So, big question is, what did they get out of this? It's just like this big political theater. Did it something more nefarious in mind by the Russians? Are they trying to negotiate something?
I don't know. We've seen that they're pretty much incompetent. There's really no getting around that. I think it's really about their pride. If they get investigated and it turns out they actually don't have all these nuclear arms that they're claiming to have, that really is not good for domestic PR for them.
So, Ashton, how many of their nuclear weapons do you think would probably, given that most are still Soviet era, aging, and probably haven't been revamped?
Hard to say for certain. Russia is not exactly transparent when it comes to most of their defense spending, let alone the spending they divert to the strategic rocket forces, which is the main force responsible for the control of Russia's nuclear arms.
Look at some of their warships and etc.
Yes.
So how well are those maintained? And then based on that, how well do you think those rockets are actually?
Yeah. Russian warships, I can say for certain, have not really been maintained very well. That may be symptomatic of the fact that a lot of the Russian warships, including the Moskva, which was sunk last year, most of those were dated back from the late Cold War period, right as the Soviet Union was in decline and then collapsed. So they had to go through that whole period of the 90s where it was basically every man for himself in Russia at one point, and they were basically just stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. As for the strategic rocket forces, as a matter of fact, rocket and missile technology is actually something that the Russians, even both during the Cold War and now, put a premium on. I know for a fact that most of Russia's defense budget in the past few years has been diverted mainly to the strategic rocket forces and the construction of new ICBMs like the Sarmat.
But unlike China and their kind of paper tiger approach, what is Russia's? Do they really have hypersonic missiles? Are they claiming that they have these?
Yeah, they've certainly got some hypersonic weapons like the Zircon in the works. Right now, the only, quote-unquote hypersonic weapon that they've currently fielding is the KH-47 Kinjal, which is basically just an Iskander ballistic missile modified to be launched from a MiG-31. But then again, a ballistic missile is already hypersonic, so not really nothing too special there.
Right. So, Ashton, my question to you, what do you think Russia gains from doing or from blocking, essentially violating START? What do you think they have in mind when they're doing this? What's their plan here?
It's hard to say for certain. I highly doubt that we're ever going to get any information regarding their plans to develop their next generation of ballistic missiles as well as nuclear delivery systems.
Yeah.
They've touted a lot of pretty scary sounding weapons previously, like those crawling torpedoes that I know Matt told me about a little while back. Mm-hmm. But the question whether or not those things actually work at this point, or whether or not Russia's actually developing those without having the whole design process fall into development hell, like what happened with the Su-57 Felon.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. A report just came out about the Su-57, claiming that they are not 5th generation fighters, but 4.5 at best.
Yeah, I think I remember I showed Jared a couple pictures of some construction defects in the Su-57, such as exposed rivets along the wings, which disrupts the stealth outline, to name a few. I also don't know too much about what sort of stealth technology Russia is capable of. I mean, it's likely they did get at least some from the F-117 that was shot down by the Serbs in 1999. But the F-117 is retired for a reason today. Its stealth technology simply is nowhere near as capable as that of the F-22, the F-35, or the B-21.
But think about that. All those aircraft were pretty much, late 80s, early 90s aircraft in development, and then, were released later. But look at the B-21 Raider.
Yeah.
That is a cool-looking aircraft.
But anyways, I think kind of getting back to what Jared was asking, now that we've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent, something that I'm kind of wondering if this may be a signal that Russia's kind of, I guess, done trying to play nice when it comes to a lot of this sort of thing, because Russia previously has violated some pretty significant treaties, like I think the INF treaty they violated with the Iskander ballistic missile system. And even though I don't have any information that can confirm this or not, I'm willing to bet that even before Russia started denying access to inspectors, I'm pretty sure they were already limiting their access little by little over time.
Yeah.
Because I remember from studying a historical example, the run-up to World War II, there was a similar sort of arrangement going on between the U.S. and Japanese navies in the run-up to World War II, where initially the Japanese would basically invite U.S. inspectors over and they'd give them like a full detailed tour of every nook and cranny of the specific basin, say the Mariana Island chain.
Yeah.
But just before the outbreak of the Pacific War, those U.S. inspectors barely even got off the plane before the Japanese were like, all right, tour's over, goodbye, have a nice, safe trip home. I'm pretty sure there was a similar situation going on in regards to Russia's participation of the START Treaty recently. But honestly, I think this is only going to push Russia further and further into isolation from the rest of the world, because if they're not going to comply with international law and regulations and try to substitute it with their own, what do other nations really have to benefit from engaging with them?
Right. I see this as a response from their perspective. I think it might be a response to the fact that, of course, now we're sending in tanks to Ukraine, and of course they're pissed off about that, and it's a way to just kind of be like, no, we don't want anything to do with you at this point. It could also be a possible just way to negotiate an ending to the war. They could say, hey, if you want to inspect, if we want to have communications, if we want to start to continue, how about we try to find a way to end this war in our own terms? Because I've heard rumors, I'm sure, Ashton, you probably heard rumors as well, that a new offensive from Russia is going to be starting up here pretty soon. I know some Ukrainians have warned about it, most likely this month. I mean, it's going to be the 1-year anniversary when the war started, so I can definitely see Putin launching something pretty big here in the coming weeks.
Yeah. I've heard this sort of thing all the way back in December of last year, or even November, especially with the Russians sending more troops into Belarus.
Yeah.
I think I've already established why I don't think Belarus would get involved, and if they did, they'd get trounced. But in a similar vein, I think I'm predicting this new Russian offensive is going to likewise fall flat, because Russia simply doesn't have all that many units that are capable of offensive action. I think, off the top of my head, they have the VDV, their paratrooper force, or at least what's left of it after this year of fighting. You've got the Wagner PMC group, but I've also heard that Wagner and the regular Russian military forces have had some sort of inner turmoil between each other. You've also have some elements of like the Black Sea Fleet's Russian naval infantry force that are still pretty good, but likewise have been depleted. And the Spetsnaz, which you guessed it, have been fighting since the beginning and have pretty much been depleted. If the Russians do go on another offensive, I'd expect them to call a second wave of mobilization to try and make up some more numbers. But if the first one is any indication, I'm not so sure as to those new troops' ability to basically launch a concerted offensive. And if the first wave of offensives back in February 2022 failed with Russia's A-grade troops, good luck trying to get anywhere near Kyiv with basically a bunch of conscripts that have had some abbreviated training and some old Cold War weapons that have been pulled out of storage at the last minute.
Right. I mean, And this is why, I mean, Zelensky is kind of asking a lot for more weaponry. I know just about a couple of days ago, Biden rejected requests to send in F-16s to Ukraine. They've been requesting those as well. So what do you guys think? You agree with what Biden said there?
Good. Finally, Biden does something good that I agree with. I mean, come on, they don't need all this equipment, especially, like Ashton said, Russia's basically running on gas fumes by now. I mean, Ukraine doesn't need all of our fancy high-tech equipment to trounce them at this point.
Here's the thing, though. Despite all of Russia's failures, they do still have advantages in certain areas. They still have advantages in the number of artillery pieces they have. They still have the advantage in the air war. They still have basically fighter jets that outclass Ukraine's because they're a newer generation and have newer weapons. The main reason why the F-16 has been requested is basically to even that sort of playing field.
Right.
And cover that deficiency.
They've been claiming they've been making gains here within the past couple of weeks. That they've been claiming back territory that they lost.
Who, the Russians?
The Russians, yeah.
Yeah, that's mostly been happening in and around Bakhmut, but it's been basically a little bit of territory at a time.
Right.
And of course, you also have the politics between Prigozhin and Wagner, as well as the regular Russian army and Gerasimov.
Right.
Just kind of muddied that victory.
So do you think, I mean, well, if you were Biden, I mean, do you agree with Biden rejecting sending F-16s down? Now, Matthew and Cameron are pretty opposed to sending F-16s, probably even the tanks as well. I don't think you guys agreed with either.
Well, Biden did say he wasn't going to send an F-16s to Ukraine, but he said he would not stop other nations that have F-16s or similar aircraft from sending those to Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I just don't want my tax dollars supporting another country's war when we have homeless people on our streets, If other countries want to do that, that's totally fine. I don't have a problem with it. I just don't want to see my tax dollars going towards that.
It's an interesting argument because, I mean, people on the pro side, I'm kind of like...
Between.
Like the in-between. Because, I see people on the pro side make the argument that Russia wins in Ukraine. What's stopping them from taking more territory, from looking outside of Ukraine, and then that starts affecting us as well. So your tax dollars will be going to a war regardless.
Well, once it starts affecting us, that's fine. I mean, I've never really agreed with America's whole world police role. I don't think it's our job to get involved in other nations' conflicts. And whether you think Ukraine deserves to be left alone or not, it's ultimately up to them to fight off invaders, in my opinion. I know that might be a bit of a controversial take, but that's pretty much how, conquest has worked for all of time, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I would humbly suggest you look up the Euromaidan Revolution, which is kind of the whole starting gun back in 2014 on this. Essentially, before then, Ukraine was ruled by a pro-Russian guy by the name of Viktor Yanukovych, and Ukraine, to be honest, was in pretty dire straits under Yanukovych. He basically sold out Ukraine to the Russians. Euromaidan was basically the people of Ukraine saying, enough of this. We want to be more aligned with US, EU, and NATO.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically ousted Yanukovych and formed a pro-Western government.
Yeah.
And it was around that time when Putin took over Crimea.
Yeah, he saw he was losing influence, and a way to gain that influence back.
Yeah.
That started all those just skirmishes throughout until the war escalated, obviously, back last year.
Yeah. I will say this much, though. Ukraine can't resist the Russian invasion without Western support. That much has been made apparent ever since this whole thing started.
Yeah. Without Western support, you think they would have fallen pretty quickly?
They probably would have put up quite more fight, but I don't think they would have been able to launch, say, the Kharkiv counteroffensive. It pretty much would have ended in a stalemate with Russians a lot closer to the Ukraine's western border with Poland and Romania, Moldova, etc.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we don't know much about Putin. I mean, the worms in his brain. I mean, who knows what's going on with this guy?
Yeah, I think there's something wrong with him, mentally. Maybe the COVID lockdown and all that, the isolation got to him or something. Because pre-COVID, he seemed he wasn't the greatest guy, obviously, but I don't think he would have done something like this. He seemed smarter than this. So I don't know why he suddenly decided to try and pull this off, knowing that the entire Western world would oppose him.
Well, I think the problem was he was basically being fed bullshit information by his subordinates. If I recall correctly, at the opening stages of this war, the Ukrainians actually captured a lot of operational orders from Russian high command in the area they were operating, and it seemed a lot of these plans basically assumed that the invasion of Ukraine would be a repeat of Crimea, where the Russians would just waltz in and take over the place instantaneously, and that the people of Ukraine would welcome the Russians as liberators with open arms.
Well, his whole justification for invasion was denazification of and essentially removing the corrupt leaders of Ukraine and, of course, demilitarizing it.
Yeah, but here's the ironic bit of it. You mentioned that you'd label the Russians of today as quote-unquote commies.
Yeah.
I would actually go so far as to argue that that's actually not true anymore. Because
I was making a joke.
But yeah, it seems I've also noticed that there's this one good YouTuber out there by the name of Kraut who made a pretty good video called The Ideology of Russia. And he basically states that the ideology of Putin's Russia is a lot more closer to that of kind of like right-wing authoritarianisms. Mm-hmm. Look up Ivan Ilyin, who was basically a Russian sort of fascist philosopher. Putin speaks highly of that guy. Mm-hmm. And you can argue a lot of... I know Wagner, a lot of Wagner's guys are actually openly wear sort of Nazi symbology, like tattoos on their shoulders and whatnot.
Interesting. So, Ashton, do you think Putin has just remained the same, cold calculator? Do you think something changed in him these past couple of years?
Well, the way I think of Putin is that he pretty much is your typical tyrannical despot in control of basically a former superpower, trying to regain some of that lost influence.
Maybe he felt like he was losing his grip, possibly.
Possibly, or like I said, since the subordinates were feeding him bullshit information, he thought he could get away with it again.
Got cocky, possibly.
Yeah.
But there's always these, these don't have, you're not going to get much out of Putin anyways, but there's always those sources that Putin has like some form of cancer, he's dying or near death eventually, so...
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know how old he is, but I'm pretty sure
he's 70 at this point.
Yeah.
I'll double check that really quickly. Let's see, because he's definitely up there. Yeah, he's 70. So I've been seeing, of course, those don't have sources that back it up. It's more just speculation than anything else is based on what they see of him. Russia's not going to say anything about that. That's a possible theory, so he wants to make his legacy known before he checks out, basically.
Possibly. I'm personally subscribing to the idea that he basically filled up his staff with a bunch of yes men and people who are basically close to him. Mm-hmm. And a good piece of evidence supporting this is that the 5th Service of the FSB, the successor to the KGB, the 5th Service is responsible for foreign surveillance in near former Soviet territories, including Ukraine.
Yeah.
The 5th Service of the FSB was actually purged after the failure of the initial Russian offensive. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen if someone does their job well. So it sounds like he basically fell for one of the greatest blunders of tyrannical despots, and he basically filled up his whole cabinet with yes men who would basically tell him what he wanted to hear, not the actual truth.
I'd say Russia will, just going back to his start, Russia will reap what it will sow. They're isolating themselves, they're allying with Iran, North Korea,
yeah,
China. So, okay, well, I don't think we can work with them anymore at this point.
Yeah.
It's sad to say. Even the Soviet Union, we improved relations over time, but Putin wants to go back to the high tense 1960s again. So,
yeah,
be my guest, as long as you don't nuke us, I guess.
Yeah. I would certainly say that we should definitely start decoupling with China. We shouldn't be doing business with China anymore, but I think that's a topic for another time.
Yeah. Next thing we're going to cover here, the College Board has stripped down AP curriculum for African American studies. So Governor Ron DeSantis especially has been very critical of the recent curriculum that has been implemented into schools, specifically high school. And in agreement, because they've been facing the College Board's been facing a lot of criticism from conservatives and DeSantis, they're purging names of many black writers and scholars associated with critical race theory from their studies from schools, from the queer experience and black feminism. And it's also getting rid of some politically fraught topics like Black Lives Matter from the formal curriculum. So they are essentially taking out these, you could say, highly debated issues from the curriculum. So big question is now, what do we think about that? Do kids have a right to learn about some of this stuff? Critical race theory, Black
Google
Lives Matter?
exists.
There's a
If you want
difference.
to learn more about it, Google it, learn it for yourself. I don't think it's necessarily something that needs to be taught in school. Not that it shouldn't, but I don't think that it necessarily needs to be taught in school.
Bingo. There's a difference between having a right to learn about something and being forced to learn about something. And some things you should probably be forced to learn about, like basic math concepts, how to speak English and read and write, that kind of thing. But when it comes to highly nuanced political ideals, it doesn't really need to be taught to every student in the system, in my opinion.
I think a far more effective strategy, which I believe DeSantis has pushed for, is learning how to budget properly, manage finances, and learn how to complete taxes. So without that, you're just going to have a lot of people stuck in the same socioeconomic loop and being unable to escape because they didn't have the proper education to escape that rat race.
I also think that when it comes to education, generally aside from like the basic education like language, history, mathematics, etc., one's studies should be geared towards what they want to do with their lives. And I think another thing that would go a long way to help improve society as a whole is if we teach the new generation of kids and students, we need to teach them the critical thinking abilities.
I think, and this is going to be a little bit of a hot take, but bear with me and don't segment this out. I think the 50s had a lot going for it, not necessarily in the societal way, but the foundation for science and math. When you look at specifically the Apollo programs, how we decided, okay, we're going to go to the moon, we're going to accomplish this, and just do it. Now, I think that should be the primary focus on, here's the math, here's the science. You don't need to confuse anything else with it. It's cut and dry. Men, women, whoever want to do it, they can go do it because everyone is capable of understanding mathematics and science. It's so cut and dry that there's no real wiggle room for different political theories within it.
Now, I will say, I'm going to read out kind of the justification from the College Board why they implemented the curriculum in the first place. Of course, they wanted to highlight the history of race in America. I'd argue race. I mean, it's been a really hot topic, especially since George Floyd.
I think everyone knows about race in America at this point. I don't think that...
But they wanted to build upon that, was what I'm saying, or what they're saying here. So obviously, they still learn about slavery, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. They learn about the Middle Passage, but they also, in their curriculum, they're highlighting contemporary topics like Black Lives Matter, the incarceration rates of African Americans, queer life, and debate over repartition.
Yeah, and it certainly seems to be like overly focused on one thing and it's completely ignoring a lot of other factors. I mean, the thing about if you want to understand our collective history, if you want to understand society, you need to look at it as a whole. You can't just micro-focus on one specific aspect
you want
of it.
to understand slavery. Okay, let's go and understand the entire world's view of slavery, down to the smallest bit of recorded history that we can. Not just in one area, but worldwide during a certain time period. Jared, I think you could attest to this. If you look at history through a certain lens, you lose a huge aspect of the history.
Yep. I mean, and we cover slavery, I mean, from the very beginning, of course. We start with 7th grade, really takes a deep dive into history, starting with the Greeks. Of course, we learn lots of slaves and their cultures. They learn about slavery essentially immediately, and it keeps building on. So, I mean, we highlight slavery throughout the different time periods.
But I don't care what aspect of history we're talking about here. You have to look at it as a whole, and no one has the right to say, oh, this is the lens you have to look at it through.
It doesn't sound like, as I also say in here, it doesn't sound like there's going to be like a big change in terms of the curriculum on that side. They're like,
I'm just speaking generally, even outside of the College Board right now.
Okay.
I think anytime you look at history, you have to do so in an objective way and not try and look at it through a modern lens.
Agreed.
Well, what's being removed now is the more contemporary topics, like learning about Black Lives Matter, about the incarceration rates, which, I mean, what do you guys think about that, removing that aspect of it?
You know, I think that obviously race plays a big role in American history and even in contemporary events. And it's good to teach about those things, but critical race theory in particular is just that, a theory. It's somebody's subjective view on race relations in this country. So I don't think that that's really on the same level as teaching about, things that we can all look at and agree are atrocities, like slavery in this country, or even how black people were treated after slavery. Obviously, that's bad and wrong, but that's widely viewed as objectively bad and wrong, whereas critical race theory is more subjective, in my opinion. So I don't think that it deserves to be taught to the same extent.
And Jared, for everyone listening, go ahead and pull up. What are the key tenets of critical race theory?
All right, so actually, I'm going to read Professor. It's a good thing you brought that up. So I was about to read Professor Crenshaw's kind of theoretical elements of why it's essential to the coursework, because she's the critical race theory scholar. So she's saying the course is a corrective, it is also intervention, it's also an expansion. And for it to be true to the mission of telling the true history, it cannot exclude intersectionality. It cannot exclude critical thinking about race. So before the final curriculum was released, her journal, or she coined the term intersectionality, which refers to the way various forms of inequality often work together, and was a word to which Florida had objected to, saying it's foundational to critical race theory. So she's saying that African American history is not just male, it's not just straight, it's not just middle class, it has a story to tell.
True history is just that. It's true history. You can look at it, you can definitively point at it, and you can say, this happened, this is why, and this is when it happened. There is no my truth, there is a truth. That's what makes it the truth.
For example, let's look at Plato. All right, Jared.
Okay.
Who was Plato?
He was a philosopher.
Did he write books?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we read a translated copy of those books today?
Yes.
So we can study Plato, right?
Yeah.
Through our own subjective lens by reading his books and reading other pieces about him around that same time period, correct? Then each of the four of us could do so and create our own differing opinions on him based on what we think, and then all four of us could have a debate about certain aspects of Plato and his life, correct?
Okay, yeah.
My point being, why does one person get to pick and say, no, this is the right way to think about something? That is the one and only issue I have with it. Just like if, Ashton, you were the sole person to be like, I know everything about Plato and this is my view and this is the only correct view in the entire history of Plato. That doesn't work. That's not correct.
I think the argument they're trying to make here, I mean, naturally the history we learn, especially in schools, is very Europeanized from the European perspective. I 100% agree with that. We don't learn a lot about the African perspective, for example. In fact, a lot of Europeans thought Africa for a good while was a dark continent, meaning it didn't have a history, but of course it did. It just didn't have a way to read about it. And what this professors, what the logic behind critical race theory or the other courses they were trying to implement is to allow students to see the other perspective.
I mean, it sounds nice in theory. I don't know how well that would go over in practice. Because if they allowed it to do so without any skew or bias and just say, okay, here it is, you can read it for yourself, and if you feel like it, great. I think people who are actually interested in history would love to read that. I, for one, would, because I think we can all attest to the poor nature of history at public schools. I think it's trash.
Yeah.
And it needs to be revamped. But it would be interesting to learn from that perspective. I just don't know if one person has the authority to say, this is how you need to teach it.
Yeah, if one person or one body of individuals has absolute authority over what gets taught in history, that's usually a bad sign.
Oh yeah, this is Adolf Hitler's view of Germany. Yeah, that sounds like a great place to start reading the history of Germany. That's the issue.
Or Xi Jinping's school of thought on Chinese philosophy.
Precisely. That encapsulates the entire issue here. It's not that we don't want to learn about it. It's that you cannot put a lens on it, because the instance that you do, it colors the entire history and makes it a skewed version.
Indeed.
Could you make the argument, though, I'm just kind of stating this, not necessarily that I believe it, but could you make the argument that DeSantis is censoring a part of history by essentially intimidating the AP or the College Board to remove these classes?
Censoring someone who is trying to censor something else, I think it kind of cancels out. I think they would both be in the wrong.
But what are they censoring? What are these AP classes censoring on African American studies?
Again, it's the lens. So it's not necessarily that they're, if you zoom in on one part of the picture, you're censoring everything else outside of that scope. And the issue is sometimes there's very critical pieces of information that they are purposefully not touching on in order to make things look a certain way or put it in a certain light. So by viewing it under a certain lens, you are inherently censoring some aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. This also all depends on whether or not, I mean, this is a required class. I assume, I mean, it's an AP class. I assume it's probably not required, though, to take. I assume to be more of an elective, which I do think does make a big difference, because I mean, it'd be optional for students to actually take as well. I mean, if this is mandatory, it might be a little bit different. Those critical of DeSantis are accusing him of censorship and the fact he's trying to imitate the College Board into appeasement.
All right, here's a TLDR version of this. All right, history is difficult. History has always been kind of subjective, and it's always been up to interpretation. That has been contested for millennia. This is nothing new, and people need to realize that and start kind of forming their own opinion on it and doing their own research.
Yeah, I think the whole purpose of historians is to basically put fresh eyes over the same sort of information, try to uncover more information, get a better picture of what happened. That's a constant, lifelong sort of endeavor.
I mean, this isn't the first time I would say that the College Board's been attacked. There's actually been past. This has happened before. Back in 2014, it had to be revised, more AP classes on U.S. history curriculum, actually.
I remember I took a push.
Yeah, so 2014, so we would have been around our time.
I was in that, yeah.
So what had to be revised, Ronald Reagan was kind of not necessarily attacked, but they called him very aggressive, unnecessarily aggressive towards the Soviet Union, and they also gave more prominence to a Native American chief than to Ben Franklin. Did you learn about that?
I'm trying to think. I don't remember if it was A push or AP Gov. I think
it
was
push.
AP Gov. I took AP Gov. I didn't take A push.
Yeah, this would be you. Well, you probably still have taken U.S. history.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, I don't even remember learning much about Reagan and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Dude, they didn't teach us shit in public school.
Not really.
I mean, I took almost all AP classes junior and senior year. And honestly, they weren't necessarily difficult. We all just got to mess around and do whatever. And the teachers were really chill because we were the smart bunch. We didn't get in trouble. I remember one time in my AP English class, we just took our laptops to the flex room and we just hooked up our laptops and played games on the TVs and stuff they had in there. It was super chill.
I did learn quite a bit from my government class, I'd say. I remember did you do mock Congress in government?
No, I did not. I don't think I...
That's unfortunate. So we did mock Congress. It was a lot of fun. So I do remember government. History classes, of course. When I took college history classes, it was kind of eye-opening about how much information they were leaving out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, there's a curriculum. I've read that curriculum millions of times now. There's a curriculum you have to follow. You have to stay on track. I mean, that could be a debate for another time, that curriculum. But
I think that's the debate we're having now.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's necessarily us against critical race theory or anything else like that. I think it's us versus the education system and how they're teaching history. While they might be taking a step in the right direction, I think it still needs further refinement before it's put into schools.
Agreed. We definitely, if there's going to be, I will say this, if there's going to be something taught, I think there has to be a standard sort of baseline sort of thing where...
And that's what they try and do with, Jared, what's it called? Common Core standards?
Yeah.
But when the government tries to say, oh, this is what kids need to know, it's the government. It doesn't fucking work. You end up with all these bullshit half-truths and everything else.
So I'm going to cap this one off by just reading some of the comments because I think they really show the divide we have right now. So one of the comments says, "What an excellent move by DeSantis. You want to read all these intersectional pseudoscientific theories? Fine, do it out in your own time. Don't you dare attempt to shove it down my child's throat. DeSantis has my vote for 24. And then this other comment says, "So glad that the College Board and its leader in quotes, Coleman, has decided to kick off Black History Month by kicking Black history to the curb. Sarcasm. Once again, it's White Privilege Month with Blacks going to the back of the line, to the back of the bus. Terrible capitulation by the College Board and an offensive, glaring affront to Blacks and other minorities." So that
You
doesn't
talk
show
about
you,
two sides that are both blatantly wrong.
that doesn't show you two extremes right there. I mean, that kind of shows you everything about where we're at right now.
I mean, they both had a point. They both brought up fair points. Yes, parents should be in charge of their child's education. If they don't want them learning something, then that's on the parent, and they should have the right to do so. But at the same time, just because one voice speaks out doesn't mean you automatically capitulate to one side.
Right.
They're making points, but they don't have any mutual respect.
I will say this much. Regardless of where we came from, regardless of what race or gender we consider ourselves, we're all humans at the end of the day. We're all capable of the exact same things. You just gotta put your mind to it.
Last comment I'll read. The Florida Republican Party has grown to be so much like the Communist Party in China. The party governs what people can be taught and what they can read, and is run by the few ruling class families.
Appeal to emotion. Invalid argument. I think what this really all boils down to is the lack of a unified American identity.
Yeah.
You look back at, how this country was founded, and yes, there was a lot of problems and trouble and strife with various races, genders, what have you, when the country was founded. But it grew into something more than that. This whole idea of the great melting pot stems from America being a place where all of that other stuff, all of your other identities don't matter. You're American, and there's an American way of thinking and doing things, and that's what we kind of all agree and subscribe to. And that's not really a thing anymore. Now it's sort of, your identity comes first, and being American is just, you just happen to be American. It doesn't really matter to you.
Right.
And I think that's a big, big part of the problem here.
And I'm going to end my point with this. So, I think these comments really just show what's wrong with America right now. Just two opposite extremes. One, of course, saying, yeah, Ron DeSantis, I want these liberals teaching my kids these ideologies 2024. Or the other extreme being, the Florida Republican Party has grown so much to be the Communist Party in China. I don't think it's a bad idea to learn about some contemporary topics. Like Black Lives Matter, they're, whether or not regardless of what we think about them, they're influential in our society. Especially since 2020, they've had a lot bigger of a role. I don't think it's bad for our kids to learn about them. However, history should not be taught, and I think I've said this before, history should not be taught with a bias. History needs to be taught, this is what happened, and you can form your own opinions on the issue. So yeah, I think it could be revised. Don't necessarily force this down their students' throats, but find a way to teach it from a completely neutral perspective. Here's what happened. Here's what's going on now in America. Here's what Black Lives Matter stands for. Form your own opinion on that. It's not our jobs to make kids form opinions. They learn about what happened, then they form their own thoughts.
And of course, teach these kids critical thinking skills.
Exactly, and I think that helps influence critical thinking skills, because by just telling them what happened, they have to think about it, and they form their own opinions from there, critical thinking. So that's my stance on it.